hosting Hot Seat over, you'll be pleased to hear, to Dr. Alexandra Thora, Chief Growth Officer of BCS Consultancy, for this, I hope, and I'm sure, it's going to be a brilliant panel on sovereign data centers. So, Alexandra, I'll leave it to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us. If we look at data center world over the last decade, we typically were speaking about scale, about efficiency. If we look at data centers today, the discussion draws more towards sovereignty, resilience, the national capabilities, and strategic control. So what governments are often asking, and questions that we need to respond potentially, is where is AI trained in the location, geographic location? Who owns the infrastructure? Who controls the data? All of these questions. And all of this turns into a balancing act between regulation and cost and planning and authorities, geopolitical risks, etc. So today what we want to do with this panel is really to explore this discussion around sovereign data centers and sovereign AI. So please welcome with me, I have to go the other way around now. Please welcome with me Mark Lewis, from Chief Sales Marketing Officer from Pulsant. Yash Isur, CEO at Nxtra by Airtel Africa. We have Martin Hoskin, Technical Director for Defense and Intelligence at Red Hat. Matt Tebay, Director at Enterprise Business, at OVHcloud. Apologies, that was my bad. And Michael Winterson, the General Secretary of the European Data Center Association. So many thanks for being at the panel with us. So first of all, when looking at the sovereignty and technology and what we are discussing in terms of data protection and privacy, we might want to start off with a narrative around the discussion of a definition of digital sovereignty. So let's just kick off with this first question. Let's start with you, Michael.
Yeah.
In your role as the General Secretary, how do you define and describe digital sovereignty in our world?
So, unfortunately, I think the issue here is this is a multi-body problem that's not solved. Sovereignty was a discussion around GDPR, data access, data control, but I think it's become much, much more complicated now. And it's issues around ownership of silicon, ownership of infrastructure, but also the brutal one of, is my service proximate to my users, and is there a way that I can be cut off in a geopolitical security way? My simple example is, what happens if more ships drag more anchors across more subsea cables, which is actually happening?
Right.
Or cybersecurity attacks attempt to bring down portions of the internet or maybe a telecom provider. So sovereignty is now a multifaceted problem, and it has a regulatory issue, it has a supply chain issue, and it has a customer or enterprise issue. And so each of these is looking at it a different way. I'll let other people keep putting in, I can get some more, but.
By all means, we're here for an open discussion.
So the key is, are we having this discussion from the enterprise point of view, in which case sovereignty is a risk analytics problem.
Right.
I have to look at my business and my digital services that support my business, and I have to do risk analytics across all of it. And as an example, I'm a teeny tiny little trade association, and I decided, could I build a European sovereign tech stack for my trade association that didn't break my bank and that was easy to manage because I don't have an IT department? And the answer is about 60% was a piece of cake. I use OVH, I use Odoo, I use New Zealand Xero for invoicing, but when it came to calendaring and Exchange and mail services, I had to go to Exchange. It was the only way. So now I use Teams and Microsoft Office, but not because I wanted to, but because I had no good alternative that didn't destroy my trade association. So that's how an enterprise looks at it, whereas I think governments and supply chain are looking at, where's my source? Yep. Chips come from Taiwan, memory comes from Korea, lithography comes from Netherlands, and the laser lenses that ASML uses come from Zeiss, Germany. So there's a sovereignty problem even all the way down at that level, that each of those markets is dominant at that really low level, let alone the server level, the data center level, the operating system level, and so on. So that's where regulators and suppliers like us have to start thinking about it.
Right. So looking from the enterprise perspective,
Yeah.
maybe switching that to the government, you were just touching government point. Like, looking at it from the government side, Martin, from a defense perspective, for instance,
Yeah.
what is your point of view? Like,
So,
why- yeah,
yeah, so sovereignty and what does it mean? And you know, we've talked about that description, and there is no real definition of sovereignty. It means what it needs to mean in order to meet your requirements from a regulatory perspective. I hear more about digital independence than sovereignty itself, because that is part of resilience. It's part of a key, any defense, intelligence sector, NATO or others. It is about digital intelligence. And NATO is a good example, actually, because if you want to talking about sovereignty, a lot of the sovereignty arguments and discussions around the Cloud Act, FISA, Patriot Act, etc., and US dominance. But the US is dominant in NATO as well. So how do you manage that from a digital sovereignty perspective in Europe? And the answer is more around digital resilience than sovereignty itself. Now, I know the EU Commission, the Digit institution, have sort of tried to define sovereignty through its framework. They've fallen short of actually defining it, but they've given criteria for sovereignty from a procurement perspective. And I think that is a really interesting first step, and it's a good baseline for countries and institutions to look at what does sovereignty mean to you, what is operational sovereignty, technical sovereignty, what do all these different elements mean to you from a business, and where does your risk lie?
so actually perfect time over as a business. So if you lie over from enterprise back to business, from a business perspective, how do you perceive these running a company? So how do you perceive these sovereign restrictions or opportunities around it?
So we are part of the Airtel group, right? So we are quite dominant telecom operators in all the markets we operate in.
Right.
And there is a acknowledgement that we have to comply to the laws of the land quite heavily from a regulatory perspective. Even if us being digital players now, you still need to merge with the telecom environment, telecom regulation, that your data needs to be in country.
Right.
The processing needs to be in country. But at the end of the day, just to add to what my peers have just mentioned, it's a balancing act, right? There are certain realities you can't deny that today you are heavily dependent on American tech.
Yep.
To quite a heavy level of, I would say, we have already committed investment. So you talk business, you need to sweat those assets. You can't just say overnight just because there are certain geopolitical tension that I need to figure out to move away,
Right.
tomorrow. It doesn't work like that. So there is a roadmap projection, a conversation which is being had in every boardroom, I'm pretty sure, that how do you kind of balance this to the level of technology which you need to be competitive on the marketplace, which means that as we speak, as of today, American tech is still quite ahead,
Right.
versus what you want to balance for the future, where you want to put investment to bring those competing independence of processing of solutions, services, software, which helps you balance those two at the same time.
So how would you balance and manage that risk aspect that Martin was just describing?
Risk from what perspective?
From this sovereignty.
Supply
Supply
chain
chain
risk,
and-
technical risk, operational risk.
Yeah, but that's
etc.
what I'm saying. You have to have those two solutions already. So there are, in all our markets, typically the way you think about is you have a dominant solution, which is predominantly you have already launched. It's already
Right.
there. You can't change that tomorrow.
Right.
But your future solutions is where we are spending a lot of money to think about how do I create that redundancy for whatever reason tomorrow. And we had this situation, Airtel in India, where there were some challenges with China and we had to figure out overnight to change tech. So there is always that balancing of, our vendor strategies, how you have balanced it between different, I would say, government tensions as well around that. And we have been able to push through these kind of investment both ways. And when you hit the wall on one, you will always have a DR or backup strategy, which you can ramp up pretty quickly so that you can actually still deliver services to customers.
Thank you. So I'm just going to jump away and kind of look at sovereignty AI or sovereignty, digital sovereignty in general, as this discussion point that is a terminology that is being increasingly used within our industry in the recent months and year. Mark, coming into marketing, for instance. Like, would you almost throw in this hypothesis that sovereignty is almost a new branding item in our industry?
I think there is very definitely a desire for businesses to want to be able to differentiate themselves based around data sovereignty and their ability to demonstrate that they do or do not do it. I think, but it sort of comes back to the point that was made a minute ago. It's around risk. So for those people that are running enterprises, we recently did some research on UK businesses. The two things that came top of their agenda around the things that help shape their data strategies were cyber risk, obviously,
right.
but then also sovereignty was second in that list. And so for enterprises, it's a risk equation. I think for infrastructure providers like us, we are a UK-only business. Pulsant delivers data centers only in the UK. We have a UK cloud only in the UK. And so for us, it's helpful for us to be able to tell prospects and clients that that we can provide the infrastructure that allows them to do whatever they want with their data and their applications, but we'll provide them with the infrastructure that they know is in the UK and isn't going anywhere else. Going back to your earlier point about a question around defining data sovereignty, I think it's a bit like the Loch Ness monster. You know, everybody's heard of it. A lot of people have different definitions of it, and a few people claim to have seen it. In the end, data sovereignty is probably closer in terms of definitional sense to something. I think he's here today. Actually, Asad Nouri recently did a really good podcast on data sovereignty, and he talked about three kind of aspects of that: the data, the application, and the infrastructure. Obviously, we only care really that much about the infrastructure because we're an infrastructure business. But I think the ability to exercise autonomy across those three things is probably the thing that helps people get closest to a definition. If you can't exercise autonomy, you can't say you have sovereignty. And so I think for businesses, a lot of infrastructure providers are trying, and you're also seeing large hyperscale clouds trying to assert a degree of sovereignty. It's a bit like, you know, sugar-free or something. It's like, and I think there's a point at which you just have to ask the question, well, is it really sugar-free, or, you know, is the CHIPS Act and the Patriot Act still, you know, relevant to you, and so on. So I think asking questions and looking at the risk is where people start.
But coming back to Michael's point, with the example that he made, with certain types of software being coming from different regions, or chips being produced in different countries, we're still reliable on those different productions. So we don't have everything within that one country, especially Europe being so fairly small or fragmented. So Matt, let me pull you into the conversation as well.
You.
So what's your take on that?
I think digital sovereignty has to be approached with an element of pragmatism as well. I don't think pure sovereignty exists, right? Because the two largest producers of semiconductors are in the US and China, right? So, but saying that, it doesn't necessarily mean that there is sensitive or customer data shared with them. If you look at AMD and Intel, for example, they'll get the data they need. There's no, you know, and that's the same for any data center provider. But so therefore, it does need an element of an approach of pragmatism, but also transparency is very important. You know, for us, when we're speaking to clients, you know, there's four really key questions that will help you start building, creating your building blocks really and foundations for a sovereign policy. And that is really understanding, you know, where that data resides, where it's located, who has control of it, who can handle it, and what it's used for. So, you know, is it used to train AI, for example? And I think if you can answer those four questions honestly, then it really gives you those foundation blocks to start building your sovereign policies.
So what are your takes? I'm just going to open, because that's a good question. So what are your takes from the various different backgrounds that you're from?
I was just going to ask, based on that comment you just made, how far can we take the definitions around data sovereignty or digital sovereignty when you start to look at what AI is going to do looking forward into the future? Because there's, you know, at the moment people are worried that Harry Potter is going to end up in their large language model, or those are genuine concerns, obviously, for Harry Potter fans. But but there's also a point where enterprises, have to deploy AI, and they have to work together in a federated way. But there's still a risk there. So how does that landscape evolve as AI starts to evolve? Because it's going to get embedded in more and more things.
My views on this, I think we are at risk of all the large language models being built in China or the US. The models that we depend on a day-by-day basis to build enterprises, to build government services, etc. And there is a risk around that. There's both an economic risk around it, based on economic growth and opportunity, but there's also a cultural risk around that as well. We are very culturally different from China and the US. I do have an example. It's a bit of an extreme example, but if you're driving there's an autonomous vehicle and it has to make a decision between hitting a human being and a cow, in the West, it would hit the cow. But take that vehicle to India, where the cow is sacred and it's protected, etc., then that model has to hit the human being. Yeah, it's an extreme example, but we're culturally different in different parts of the world, and we do run the risk of all of the services that rely on language models being westernized, if you like.
And I think just to add to that, it's not just around enterprise owning the AI model itself. It's around controlling the whole stack, from the compute, the data, the infrastructure, and the governance around it. That's really important. But going back to Martin's point there, we have so much reliance on buying from US tech companies. And the more we do that, the more we're impacting the UK and European technology businesses, because that's stifling our growth and our ability to provide the credible alternatives. I sound like Boris Johnson here, I think it was him. What is it, buy local? The initiatives around buy local, especially around the food industry as well. And I think we kind of need to put our money where our data is, as well as our food, to really help European and UK technology businesses to grow and actually deliver a true sovereign solution.
Yeah, and I guess that, Yash, you said it first. We as data center or digital infrastructure builders and operators are beholden to the laws of the land within which we operate. And I think at the digital infrastructure level, we already have that certain definition of sovereignty, which is that our physical elements of our business are controlled by laws that have been dealing with physical real estate issues for the past millennia. So we can kind of rest assured that at that level it's dealt with. So I think when we're getting into this discussion around data, the only thing we can really look at is GDPR, which became reality 10 years ago. And the problem is, I actually did a little refresher course on what GDPR is. Most of us have a completely warped view of what data protection is covered by GDPR. For starters, it has nothing to do with where the data is. Nothing. You can store that data anywhere in the world. You just have to be compliant with a set of 7 or 8 guidelines with how you collect it, what you use it for, like don't dump it into an AI model, and what the originator of the data has rights to as well, including to be forgotten, to have that data deleted, or to have an audit of what that data was used for. But there's no geography in any of this conversation. And the other thing that's interesting about sovereignty, especially in Europe, is that the UK is part of GDPR. And a lot of Europeans say, we wouldn't put our data in the UK because they're not part of Europe. Well, there is actually the UK GDPR Act, which Europe recognizes as part of sovereignty. So sovereignty is a continent-wide thing. And this is the world's second largest GDP. It's actually larger GDP than China, less than North America. It's the world's 3rd largest population. And so I think Europe created this super powerful tool to define European standards of sovereignty, and yet each member state is trying to say, I want my little piece of the pie. That's actually really bad behavior. And I think that's what we need to focus on is, as an industry, yes, we understand that Europe has a rule around sovereignty, and we need to honor that. But it doesn't mean that that data has to be right there. It just means that I have to know that it's being managed in a way that I have agreed to, or that my customers have agreed to. And I think we forget that, and I think that's what's changing as well, as people are coming back to, well, now it has to be near me, but I think the reason why it has to be near me is because that physical hard disk has to be under my legislative control, because we're not liking the direction of the two other leading global economies.
So based on that, do you think, and then I'm opening this up to the panel,
Yeah.
do you think this will turn into some sort of additional fragmentation, create borders, actually a counter-EU approach, everybody having their own almost national data centers, like like banks, for
It's
instance?
already happening. Go ahead.
Yep.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, we operate in multiple countries, and this is exactly what we are seeing is that governments are now way more concerned about where the data sits. But more than where the data sits is who has access to the data. And with AI, we talk about the training, but the inference part is also very important. Who is actually able to action on those data? Like there is a very well-known company who's having driverless cars running around.
Right.
But then somebody else somewhere else in the world can actually make that car do something different. How do you manage that? And that's what we know. The future is what are the other services which we don't even know what will be the impact of those services coming in with AI. So to be able to be forthcoming and understand what are the other risks which is being carried with this aspect of having data somewhere else and having no control on who is accessing those data. I think governments are now asking big players to be like, we want you to also advise us what will be the risk coming with these kind of strategies. And we see that reverse asking process now, where before we were trying to chase government, telling them, you guys need to help us out on ABC. We're like, no, you got to help us now understand, because the technology is new, there's a lot of things happening, it's going too fast. Then how do you manage that? It's the tech part, I think, is, I won't say the easy part, I think people know it is what it is.
Yeah.
But the data and the speed of actioning on those data, I think this is a bigger concern which a lot of governments are having. How do you work around that?
I think that's interesting, but there's just to pick up on that. If you look in the UK, recently the government classified data centres as critical national infrastructure. Finally, after several decades of thinking about it, then as a result of doing that, what they've obviously now done is started to introduce quite a lot of forms that need to be filled out and lots of interesting paperwork that needs to be completed on a regular and frequent basis, and that's terrific. Except for, on the one hand, we're saying, well, okay, this infrastructure is critical to our country and to our and nationally, but at the same time, we're not differentiating between what is the infrastructure and what is actually the data. So, for instance, we're a data center operator. I think of it like a car park. I don't really care what car you bring into the car park. I'm just going to operate the space for you. But there's a lack of understanding about how that infrastructure all connects together, because the data that you move in and out of the data center really has nothing to do with the operator, and yet it's the operator who's having to take, in some senses, some control over responsibility for reporting on it. And I think that legislative inability to differentiate the nuances in an industry probably isn't going to help data sovereignty become any stronger anytime soon. It's just going to add more bureaucracy, perhaps.
Yeah. I wanted to come back on Yash's point as well. We've got to find a balance. This isn't really about isolationism. We don't want to become isolated from technology in the US and China, etc.
Yep.
And also that not all data is equal. We have different classifications of data from a government perspective and from a business enterprise perspective. And unclassified data, then that's probably fine on a US provider and inside the UK. When you're talking about secret data or above secret, that maybe we have to consider that has to be kept sovereign and residing within the data centers, in the UK. But I do think we have to find this federated hybrid balance of what's right, rather than think about isolationism as a solution.
I agree too.
But okay, then I'm going to be the capitalist that I am, and I know I sound American, but I'm a European capitalist. I live here, I love here, but I'm a capitalist, and to me the importance is that, to me, this phrase sovereign is scary and negative and probably self-defeating, and it's something that we need to contemplate the message behind it, the geopolitical risks that are present today, as well as the issues of, is this agentic AI operating on my behalf or on someone else's behalf, who is not beholden to the same sovereign laws I'm beholden to. So I get the problem, and the problem's real, but I have the fear that it will go too far. And I feel like we need to break it down and turn it into a market driver and say, okay, you as an enterprise, you're a capitalist system, you've got to deliver your service, and you have to not break these laws and on your bike. You figure it out. And I think that's the thing, is we need to make sure that regulators don't get so specific on the definitions of what is sovereign that the whole thing just falls down and becomes either stupidly expensive or unenforceable. Because again, imagine, I mean, you know, I worked very closely with OVH over the past few years with a lot of the work we've been doing in Brussels. And I'm very excited about the way you analyze the sovereignty of all the elements of your business as well as your sustainability. And but I'm realizing that at some level, down at the chip level, that has to fall down until Europe becomes a world leader chip manufacturer. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's an industrial policy that Europe is going to have to start thinking about. Like, do we need a chip policy like we have a common agricultural policy? I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Potentially at some...
And I suppose they nod of heads, let's get the audience involved. Has anyone heard of UVHcloud?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can't tell you what it is, but I've heard of it.
Okay. If you want to know more about what true sovereignty is, that's it. Yeah. It's the highest level of data protection. That's the envy of other European countries. It goes down to even defining that only EU citizens can enter that data center, that part of the data center, or the whole data center itself. Biometric access to get in, etc. But that covers all the three elements: the technology, the operational, and the data aspect of sovereignty. So, for me, that is probably the clearest kind of model that's available today from the likes of OVHcloud and other cloud providers as well. But it's but the thing is, it's a proven model. It's a proven model. I think 6 years it's been out, been available, UVHcloud certification. But that for me and for OVHcloud is the true definition of what sovereignty is.
But France is definitely leading the way in digital sovereignty across Europe and the globe, probably. France is 2-3 years ahead than most of other European countries and the UK as well.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to touch a point I thought was quite interesting on the capitalist comment.
Yes.
So, of course, with all of this, there's a cost associated to it.
Yes.
So who actually carries the cost? Is it governments? Is it
It's a myth.
the enterprise?
There should be no compromise between sovereignty and performance and cost. I suppose it shouldn't cost you more to be sovereign. Like, especially with OVHcloud, it's part of the DNA.
Right.
Sovereign's been part of their foundation since 2003 when they started to build its data centers. So, for us, it's standard. Data stays your data. As simple as that. And we're a European headquartered business as well. We can guarantee that, and probably the same with Pulsant as well.
Yeah, I would disagree a little bit because I used to work in the US for a very big hyperscaler, the biggest one in the world. And what I can say, it does come at a cost. I mean, it depends a lot on the...
I've seen their proposition. It does come at a cost, but it shouldn't do. It's unfair.
It comes at if a data classification is highly sensitive, even the build of a data center is differentiated from an access perspective, from a material perspective. So from the ground up what you're building, the equipment which goes inside is all heavily regulated. Then it's not only as us being the car park, the way when you look at data being highly sensitive, it's the car park and the car being part of it.
Yeah.
And where the thinking process is, like you were mentioning, money is not as critical in that aspect because the data is highly sensitive. So it goes as much as we need to spend to make it happen. But now to your point about enterprises, that's a bit of a different call. Then there's a balance you need to make because ultimately you can't go too extreme, otherwise the cost to the customer will not make sense. But there is this, I would say, data classification perspective which has to be put in play depending on certain governments, certain way of looking at things. At least I've seen in the US, the way it's being managed is to a level I've never seen in my life, right? Very different.
for the US hyperscalers, all except Oracle charge more for their sovereign brand services than for their standard commercial services. So AWS, Microsoft, Google, etc., they have a separate classification of cost models for sovereign services. And it's another discussion of how sovereign those sovereign services are, but only Oracle actually have an equilibrium of cost for those services.
Yeah, I guess what I was clarifying is the sovereign and government
Yeah,
sovereign.
exactly. Yeah.
Government sovereign is a different level
Yeah.
of
But if
sensitivity.
I can square the circle of what sounds like a conflict, what both of you are saying is not it's not a conflict. What I'm saying is that you allow a market economy to find the equation and the answer to the equation. It's I can buy a private jet, I can rent a private jet, I can buy a first class ticket, I can buy an economy ticket, and I can go standby. And it's the same thing. I get to A to B. But each of them has a different level of elements behind them, including a sustainability element, a performance element, and a security element.
Right.
Funny enough, the private jet is not the most secure solution, but okay, fine. So you let the capitalist system deal with the equation, and it will find the most efficient, right price, whether it's product differentiation a la 3 clouds, or whether it's product standardization a la OVH and Oracle. The market will decide, and the market will buy it. And so that's how this gets solved. So having regulators get too heavily involved in defining this will actually just ossify what is a very, very dynamic market. And we've already dealt with this on uptime. 25 years ago, 30 years ago, when we were building the first data centers, we had no idea what quality to build towards. We today now know things like uptime, with real data proving that uptime. We have classifications of data centers, and we can speak competently about things like tier 3 or tier 4 or 5 nines or 6 nines, and people now trust that and run mission critical solutions that they would have never put in a data center 25 years, co-location or cloud data center 25 years ago. So we solved that problem using market dynamics. We've solved sustainability through market dynamics. It's priced into our model now. We now are delivering that. So now this is the next thing that we will, as engineers, sort out, and as marketeers will price and productize, and it will get solved. So I'm not worried. I'm worried about over-definition by regulators. That's my biggest fear. Yeah.
That wouldn't be anything on you, right?
Well, I mean, CIDA, I don't know for those of you who know about it, the Cloud and AI Development Act was supposed to come out in March. It got delayed to April. It got delayed to May 27th, next Wednesday. And I've just found out this morning it's delayed till June 3rd. So for those of us who will be at Data Cloud and Con, we'll be hearing about it then. There will be an element inside of it, and I've spoken with the European Commission about it, and it's probably going to have flavors of the FedRAMP system in North America, funny enough. Call that plagiarism, I don't know. A sovereign system being stolen by Europe and implemented here.
Okay, so looking into the future, because this is like the baseline for the future. So looking into the future, what is, and it's an open question, what is your take on a potential federated sovereignty concept for data centers?
I think I'd kind of build on what you just said a minute ago there. I think federated, if you look at most technology, most of the time, it's mostly federated. There's not that much that's really monolithic. So in most cases, most enterprises take a sensible choice about what represents risk to them, what represents certainty, what represents cost, what represents performance. So they'll factor those things in, and then they'll make a decision on that basis, which, to your point, is the market making a decision. So I think federated is the way that it will end up being. People will pick the things that work best for them at any one time, and they'll pick the locations that work best for them, and they'll pick the kind of infrastructure that works best for them as well. So there's almost no chance that you're going to end up with a system which is utterly sovereign, utterly separate, or utterly monolithic. It's always going to be somewhere in the middle, and it's always going to comprise decisions around risk, cost, and performance.
And then who owns that information, though?
Who owns who owns the information? Oh well, I mean, if ownership of information and intellectual property is something that's that's a huge subject that we could spend quite a long time on. I think
still have 10 minutes.
We have 10 minutes and 16 seconds. I think that's probably a more interesting area than actually what happens with most of the infrastructure, because to the points made earlier by everybody on this panel, if you drill it right down to the silica, then you just won't get that level of granularity out of any definition of sovereignty. So I think some federation, some level of risk. If you want to own the IP over a particular piece of data, then you treat it one way. And if you don't, and you don't care about it, and you're just a processor, then it's a different consideration. But maybe you have a different view.
I think the differentiator is legal jurisdiction over the data. So it's not so much who owns the data, because data can be owned by multiple people. It can be personal data, it can be enterprise corporate data. But who has legal jurisdiction over that data is I think, the key point that differentiates sovereignty in many, many cases. Not entirely, I fully acknowledge that, but that is the differentiator. So if it's a US provider, and we know about the Cloud Act and Pfizer and the Patriot Act and all those different elements, then that data effectively is, the jurisdictional control lands outside of that country and somewhere else, and some control somewhere else. But I think that will be the key differentiator between regional sovereignty, hyperscaler sovereignty, data center sovereignty, etc. I think that's the key point that you can pull out and say, this is what it means to our business from a risk perspective. We have legal control over our data.
Mm-hmm. I think just to add to that, I think the operational side of it as well, though, is key, because working with companies all across Europe, it is interesting what we were saying before around, will we ever get to like one kind of definition across the 27 EU countries? I have the pleasure of having to read a lot of the government frameworks. It's good bedtime reading. And it's for like Scandinavia, Latvia, Netherlands, they're all trying to achieve the same thing, but they're just putting it in different formats, different ways of putting it. And I think there is a way we can all kind of have a federated approach to digital sovereignty. But the operational side as well, we're getting more and more questions now about who can access service tickets, going down to that nth degree of detail of, okay, so you're using a PaaS platform they're using our PaaS platform, let's say they're using Ivan technology, for example. Who's the third line support in Ivan? Is it in America, is it in Sweden, or where is it, or in Finland, wherever it may be? And they're going down to that nth degree now, and that's how we're seeing that governments are approaching this. It's not just the data, which everything Martin said is absolutely applicable. It's also down to who actually can handle a service ticket, a support ticket for that customer as well. And they're the protections that I see that governments are looking for.
I guess keeping this really simple about who owns the data, I actually want to push back a bit on your idea that you can have multiple owners of data. Don't forget, the sovereignty discussion has several elements, but the part we seem to be focusing on is this issue of rights. Europe, everybody complains that America innovates and Europe regulates, but what's really going on is in America, the person who collects the data owns the data. That's the fundamental thing. It's a corporatist economy. It pushes for ownership as whoever's invested the capital to collect and scrape that data, it's theirs and it's theirs forever. Europe has fundamentally said, no way, Jose. The data is owned ultimately forever by the creator of that data footprint, and that is a citizen, a human. And the corporate is merely a guest borrower of that data. That's fundamentally where I think Europe is trying to push on the AI sovereignty issue at the data level. And of course in China, the state owns the data, so it doesn't matter. That's the end of the conversation. So I think this is the fundamental fight, and why it's coming up with AI is because this is where these two policies of the data is owned by the person, borrowed by the company, versus the company owns the data, is AI is absolutely causing that fight. And that fight is coming out. But I ultimately don't think this fight is the fight that matters. The fight that matters, I think, still comes back to Yash's original point, which is, in the end, if the world goes to hell in a handbasket and we have wars everywhere, what matters is, where's the data, where's my building, and can I access it? And that's ultimately sovereignty. You can then have an industrial policy to say what percentage of the technology stack is also in my sovereign control if the world goes to hell in a handbasket. But that's another issue altogether outside of this conversation today.
Very exciting. I would love to continue, but just looking at the time. We have 5 minutes to spare, and I would like to open the panel to the questions to the audience. If anybody has any questions, I can't see very well because the light is like literally my face. So if there's anyone who has questions, yes, please.
Thank you for a really excellent panel. My name is Doreen. The question, I'm fully behind what the EU is doing, in particular with the EU AI Data Act. However, we have China. We have a country that is innovating faster than even the Americans are. What is the point of regulating here in Europe or even in the US if then Asia just moves ahead far more than we can then catch up?
I suppose the fear from governments is that what's this data being used for? If they can get access to that data, the government, like under the Patriot Act and FISA Section 702, the government can get hold of that data. And the fear is that what is it going to be used for? What purpose? Is it economic purposes? Is it political purposes? And that's just not right. That's not fair on the consumers. It's not fair on us. So I think that's why really is that fear of what the data could be used for.
But I think education is part of the answer here. Is how do you educate people who use services on their phones, don't really think about where that data has been stored, where those photos are being stored, and educate them about, well, that is your personal private data. When you share it with this particular company, whether it's TikTok or someone else, then that becomes theirs. In China particularly, the data is owned by the state. There is the same types of laws in China about, about Chinese government accessing enterprise data within Chinese organizations. They exist there in exactly the same way they do in the US. So I think we have to educate young people, educate people in general, about data management and personal privacy as well. And I think that is the only way we could do it. We can't, back to the isolationism comment, we can't isolate the UK, we can't isolate Europe from what happens in the rest of the world. We have to think more broadly and just try and provide a competitive market. But education and particularly education about privacy, I think is really key.
Just building on Martin's point there, I think things get abstracted to quite a significant level, and AI has the capacity to do that. And I think understanding what the fundamental infrastructure on which your enterprise is dependent, understanding what that infrastructure is, where it is, how it's managed, how it's operated, that kind of understanding at an enterprise level is something that you can't lose sight of, because if you do lose sight of it, then you're also introducing risk and so on. But so to answer the question that you posed, I think the competitiveness has to continue, but industries and businesses have to understand the infrastructure and how that infrastructure is being used in order to pursue their competitiveness going forward. That's
I can answer this a little bit more bluntly, if that's okay. I think I have the advantage, obviously, having worked on all three sides of a world. I can tell you Europe is doing a lot now, and I think it has seen that there's a requirement to move faster, invest bigger. I mean, OVH are the perfect example. They are investing quite massively in Europe. Capacities which I never saw in Europe 5 years ago when I was working with US. Now I can see this amount of megawatt, gigawatt levels of capacity being deployed in Europe. So just saying that Europe is regulating, I don't think it's fair. I think there is that acknowledgement that now is the right time to invest. I think at least I've seen in UK, I've seen in France, I've been reading around all these other European markets as well, Milan, Frankfurt. A lot of investment is going to make Europe competitive in that space. That said, my biggest concern is that short-term mess we are creating with AI, because European data, just because people want to be competitive, now it's sitting somewhere else, being processed somewhere else. I think that short-term mess will have to be cleaned up at some point, but Europe definitely, I think, is not. I don't think Europe is on the back seat, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. But the more we keep spending with US and Chinese technology companies, the more it impacts us.
That's true, that's true. We're running out of time, but do we have one more question? Anybody in the audience? Yes? Or do we have a microphone over here? Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, really interesting panel, guys. And really interesting kind of set of views across the panel. We've obviously got some colo providers, some cloud providers. Completely understand the sovereignty angle from a cloud standpoint. Really interested for the colo guys, what your viewpoint is on sovereignty in terms of whether it's a question of your proposition and your marketing strategy, or whether there is a fundamentally differentiated co-location product that you are providing for sovereign customers. Like, understand you mentioned access being possibly a way in which you would differentiate your product, your actual data centers for those customers, but is it more of a kind of proposition and marketing thing for you, or is it more of a product thing?
I think it's an excellent question. I think it's an excellent question. It's a combination of those two things. So I think for us, we have a natural differentiation in being inherently sovereign in the UK because we're only here. We do have clients who, who I think will be happy to buy a sovereign service from within that, and it's possibly the case that for the cloud providers as well. And I think we see, looking at the research, we see that as an opportunity. We see that as a growing marketplace. We have clients who have moved away from public cloud, from hyperscaler cloud, and wanted to have more private cloud deployments, and they're willing to pay for that. So I think it is both. The underlying product, the data center, is basically quite similar, although some are more secure, some are slightly less secure, some are more resilient, some are less resilient. But fundamentally, the service that they get, the package they're buying, I think there's demand out there for a sovereign service. Yeah, absolutely, definitely.
From Airtel's perspective, I mean, we are quite massive in India, right? We're the second biggest mobile operator in the world. Where when you have scale, the thinking is a little bit different. So to answer very simply your question is, in other markets where we operate, we don't have a full sovereign stack, which is technology which is being developed in country, which is ring fenced for the country, but rather than a mix of international companies where their services is actually mixed with our footprint in the country to create that data. I would say hosting sovereignty is there, but processing sovereignty is there. The access also is quite heavily controlled. But from a technology perspective, in India we have the Airtel cloud, which is developed by Airtel, it's a sovereign cloud, government cloud, approved to be used within the market. But outside, we deploy more from a hosting perspective, from an access perspective, but not more than that. So it's a question of scale, plus a question of how you look at a strategy from a country to country. Not all countries have the scale to actually deploy their own kind of end-to-end product.
And I'll defer to the data center providers because
I thought it was for the colo guys.
Good.
Sorry, question.
Very quick.
No, go on.
No. I just wanted to say just a quick one because I think.
Yeah.
I'll follow you.
Yes. No, please.
Oh, right. Okay.
But do respond to the question, please.
Can you just repeat the question again? Apologies. In short term.
In short, is it more a question?
Sorry. Yeah, that was it. Sorry, marketing. As Mark said, it's a bit of both, isn't it? I suppose there is our standard proposition OVHcloud is data stays your data. It's sovereign by design. Okay, so that doesn't cost anything. That's part of the standard proposition that we have today. We kind of split sovereignty in between. It's sovereignty. Yeah, you can say it's like a marketing philosophy, I suppose. But the performance is where the value actually is, and that's what we deliver: high performance products in a sovereign environment.
I think in the colo space, from a product point of view, because that used to be my role, is besides the vetting of staff, which is a critical element of the data center, in the colo space, there are two things that you can do. You can help customers define private cloud solutions when they do touch into public cloud, or private public cloud-based solutions, using cross connects where you can prove that there's a physical connection and no ability to be connected, someone to steal that connectivity. You can also work with a lot of clients on things like removing their exposed VPN footprint to the internet by using telecom services and cross connects to remove hacking points or access points from what is effectively a globally visible solution, the internet. Those are probably the two biggest products you can work on.
I see we could continue this discussion. Yep. Highly interesting, so diverse. We could continue for probably another hour if we may, but we do have to come to an end. Thank you so much for this really engaging discussion. Thank you, dear audience. We're still all going to be around, so if anybody still has follow-up questions or want to get in touch, please do. Thank you so much for your time and your valuable insights, and See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone.